Zdzisław Beksiński's dystopian scenery crawls with menacing creatures and star-crossed souls. The visionary Polish artist raised an epic universe of hellscapes before meeting an untimely end as macabre as his work. This is Several Circles. Damned life forms traverse dismal terrain inhabited by ominous beings. Forbidding fortresses dominate the decay, and doom hangs heavy in the atmosphere, stagnant and suffocating. Sinister forces abound in Beksiński's post-apocalyptic world, an infernal limbo haunted by restless spirits, much like his empirical world, in which the fear and suffering were all too real. Beksiński was born in the historic Polish town of Sanok in 1929, so he came of age in the throes of World War II. Sanok was home to a sizable Jewish population, which swelled with an influx of refugees from neighboring nations before it was annihilated by the Nazis. They tore through town in 1939, burning synagogues and destroying libraries, and eventually established a concentration camp on Sanok's outskirts. Those who fled back to their homes were executed, as were the sick, the elderly, and the courageous who dared to shelter their hunted neighbors. But non-Jewish Poles were also in terrible danger. The Polish people at large were treated barbarically as Poland was mercilessly besieged by Nazi invasion from the west and Soviet invasion from the east. After the war, an oppressive communist regime was instituted by the USSR and brought with it all the discomforts of rationing and restricted freedoms until 1989. It stands to reason that this crushing climate of violence and violation would elicit Beksiński's fixation with horror, and yet he adamantly rejected the seemingly obvious read, asserting that there's no autobiographical depth to be mined. On the contrary, he described these images as optimistic and even humorous. Beksiński's willful aversion to critical analysis makes critical analysis of his work a challenge, if not a misguided endeavor, since he was so vehemently opposed to interpretation. But to view his art without context feels unjustly superficial, so with all due respect, we'll circumvent his wishes. Despite an early interest in art, especially the work of the Romantic period painter and draftsman Artur Grotger, Beksiński studied architecture in the burgeoning era of brutalism, a term derived not from the brutality of the aesthetic, but rather from the French béton brut, which simply translates to raw concrete. Still, brutalism is brutal and evokes the austerity of post-war life. Beksiński completed his education in Krakow, where he may have attended the Contemporary Art Exhibition of 1948 to see the works of the modernist Krakow group. After briefly serving as a construction site manager, he returned to Sanok in the mid-1950s and took a job designing buses. He was uninspired by the gig, but seduced by his industrial environment. As a side project, he began to experiment with found materials, transforming metal and plaster into semi-abstract sculptures. He translated these skeletal forms into paintings which, intentionally or not, echo the abrasiveness of portraits by the inventive Swiss-German artist Paul Klee, the Spanish king of distortion Pablo Picasso, and the abstract expressionist Willem de Kooning. They could even be said to anticipate the later neo-expressionist style of Jean-Michel Basquiat. Basquiat is only one of the many celebrated blue-chip artists whose coveted work you can invest in through Masterworks. Founded in 2017 by a top 100 art collector, together with the Council of Tech Entrepreneurs, Masterworks is the first platform for buying and selling shares representing an investment in artworks by titans of art history, including Pablo Picasso and Andy Warhol, as well as leading contemporary artists such as Banksy and Yayoi Kusama. Thanks to best-in-class research and acquisitions teams who determine which pieces to purchase and sell at optimal prices, you can buy in at a fraction of what major collectors pay. And in 2021, Masterworks members saw a 31% return on their investments. Art is a stable and appreciating asset class. Contemporary art prices outpaced the S&P 500 total return by 164% from 1995 to 2021. Join the 325,000 people who have signed up for Masterworks and diversify your portfolio by investing in some of the biggest and most beloved names in art. Visit the description below to learn more. It was Beksiński's disquieting black and white photographs that garnered the most attention at the time. A foray into the medium during his studies in Krakow prompted an enduring interest in the lens-based arts, so he may have been aware of his avant-garde contemporaries, including Marcel Duchamp and Man Ray, both of whom contributed to the early 20th century Dada and Surrealism movements, as well as German Expressionism, a shadowy film movement spawned, like Dada, from the psychological trenches of World War I. Persuaded by the mystifying forces of the psyche, Beksiński honed a keen eye for surreal intervention, for stylizing and distorting reality in curious and compelling manners. But the mid-century mainstream had acquired a taste for photojournalism, images that documented the marginalized, the gritty, the elegant, and the wondrous facets of modern-day society. When Beksiński exhibited his early work in the late 50s, the loudest criticism came from Alfred Ligotsky, a photography purist who argued against Surrealism for its perversion of this reality-based medium. He referred to Beksiński's approach as anti-photography, perhaps in reference to Dada, the anti-art movement that sought to invert logic and defy reason in a show of irreverence towards society. Beksiński responded with an essay in Photography magazine entitled The Crisis in Photography and the Perspective to Overcome It, in which he made a case for unbound freedom of expression and for letting things get weird. Still, Beksiński became frustrated with photography's limitations, that he could only manipulate his subjects, but never create them from scratch. So he abandoned the practice in favor of drawing and painting, and he would dedicate the rest of his life to art. The 1960s through the mid-80s would become known as Beksiński's fantastic period, in which he probed a seemingly subconscious realm to realize ghostly structures and ghastly landscapes in painstaking, almost obsessive detail. "I wish to paint in such a manner as though I were photographing dreams," Beksiński once said, later contradicting that sentiment by clarifying, "All opinions that I allegedly paint dreams come from journalists." Regardless, Beksiński's compulsion to confront primal fears and fantasies made his work feel distinctly honest and of the times. There was nothing naive about Beksiński, but his positioning as a so-called naive artist, one who operates outside the confines of formal training and institutional influence, yielded a kind of devil-may-care disregard for trends, and he leaned into his growing reputation as a maverick modernist, untethered to anything other than his own mysterious muses. While Beksiński maintained that he was more or less unconcerned with artistic traditions, there are unignorable parallels between his work and that of Hieronymus Bosch, the early Netherlandish painter of chaotic, cacophonous hellscapes, of the stomach-turning satires by Spanish artist Francisco de Goya, of the German Käthe Kollwitz, whose expressionistic portraits exposed the obliterative anguish of losing her son to World War I and her grandson to World War II, and of the surrealists such as Remedios Varo and Max Ernst. Beksiński was clearly guided to some degree by the principles of Surrealism, which emerged in Paris around the late 1910s. Derived from Dada's irrational rationale, Surrealism was initially a literary movement that began with the practice of automatic writing, a means of liberating the mind from the fetters of conscious thought. In 1924, the poet, critic, and trained doctor and psychiatrist André Breton published the Surrealist Manifesto, in which he articulated the urge to peek behind the curtain of our performative social selves. Surrealism presented a new, metaphysical mode characterized by remarkable happenings and uncanny juxtapositions. Vanguard visionaries including Man Ray, Duchamp, and Ernst, as well as Giorgio de Chirico, Joan Miró, Jean Arp, and Leonora Carrington profoundly influenced the Surrealist aesthetic, which was most famously honed by the likes of Salvador Dalí and René Magritte. It was Magritte who famously said in a most Beksińskian manner that the purpose of art is mystery. So while Beksiński objected to any direct connections forged between his work and theirs, it still seems to have served as a freewheeling framework for him to build out as he pleased. But as artists do, Beksiński's signature style continued to evolve. From his long-running Fantastic series, he pivoted into a phase distinguished by muted colors, gestural brushwork, and sculptural forms. In the mid-80s, Beksiński found a champion in an art dealer who staged successful exhibitions of Beksiński's work from the United States to Japan, though Beksiński never left Poland himself. As he became better known, fans and critics alike would naturally paint him as a tortured artist, and that would make for a much tidier story, but it doesn't appear to have been the case. In interviews, he would buoyantly illuminate his method, describing his long-term love affair with music. Classical was a prerequisite for his creative process, in part because he supposedly detested working in silence, but also because he was galvanized by the genre's emotive qualities. "If my art is about anything at all," he once said, "it's the mood and atmosphere." He deflected any and all suggested explanations for what his paintings could mean, and went as far as to say that even he didn't know, or care for that matter. For this reason, he rarely, if ever, titled his finished work. So he shrouded himself in this impenetrable mythology, rife with contradictions and unanswered questions. But his insistence that this is purely aesthetic is unsatisfying. For a man who spurned symbolism, his paintings are richly symbolic down to the pigment itself. Punctuating all the browns and burnt umbers is this vivid shade of blue, more specifically Prussian blue, a romanticized name that nods to the prussic acid in its chemical makeup, also known as hydrogen cyanide, which was used to engineer a pesticide deployed in the gas chambers. So while Beksiński insisted, quote, "Meaning is meaningless to me. I do not care for symbolism, and I paint what I paint without meditating on a story," it's hard to believe that he was being entirely sincere. Beksiński's style changed dramatically in the 90s when new software programs reinvigorated his interest in photography. It's often noted that this period in Beksiński's practice lacks the soul of his paintings, and the decade at large would mark his decline. Since the 1970s, he had enjoyed a quiet, private life in the Polish capital of Warsaw with his wife Zofia and their son Tomasz. In 1998, Zofia died of cancer, and on Christmas Eve, 1999, Tomasz committed suicide. Devastated, Beksiński retreated even further into solitude. On February 21, 2005, a 75-year-old Beksiński was pulled into an altercation with 19-year-old Robert Kupiec, who demanded the artist lend him the equivalent of about $100. The two knew each other, as Kupiec was the son of Beksiński's caretaker, but when Beksiński refused to lend him the money, Kupiec stabbed him 17 times. Beksiński's gruesome murder sent chills up the spines of his admirers across Poland and around the world, all the more disturbing for the way his art seemed to prophesy a grim demise. Beksiński's final painting depicts a haunting form that looks like it's being consumed by the void. Fortuitously completed on the day of his death, it's simply but profoundly signed, "Y." A dedicated gallery in the Historical Museum of Sanok holds about 600 of Beksiński's artworks, the largest collection of its kind in the world. But it's arguably the internet that's played the largest role in preserving and proliferating Beksiński's legacy. Despite his acute similarity to artists such as H.R. Giger, probably best known for his work on Ridley Scott's Alien, the American photographer Joel Peter Witkin, and the American artist and filmmaker David Lynch, all of whom have been duly recognized by the mainstream, Beksiński has yet to be canonized by the art market, so he lurks, perhaps more fittingly, in the public domain, there for anyone to discover and interpret for themselves. But directly and indirectly, that edgy Beksińskian mood seeped into the subculture, complementing the heavy riffs of rock, featuring on album covers, and setting the tone for dark, surreal films. In 2016, a Polish biopic about Beksiński was released to critical acclaim. Maybe Beksiński sincerely couldn't verbalize the atrocities that he bore witness to during his lifetime, but his art speaks volumes with an acid tongue. This episode's community spotlight is on Rochester, New York adjacent draftsman and painter Daniel Raymond Chadwick, whose subtly surreal images hint at what lies beneath. His fine art education at the University of Buffalo, in addition to his study of religion and humanities, inform his fascination with the internet, nature, illusions and impossible spaces, and of course, the vast art history continuum, where he derives inspiration from Hieronymus Bosch, Francisco de Goya, and René Magritte, as well as the Flemish Renaissance painter Peter Bruegel the Elder, the English painter and satirist William Hogarth, Dutch graphic artist and Lord of Illusions M.C. Escher, and Americana extraordinaire Norman Rockwell. Visit the comment section of this video to learn more about Daniel. Thanks for watching Several Circles. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos about the lives and work of extraordinary artists from across history and the present day. Let us know in the comments if there's an artist you'd like to know more about, and if you're an artist yourself, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch for your potential community spotlight feature.